What if I told you that one of the cutest Thanksgiving specials ever made actually got something right by accident? When the mouse in the Mayflower introduced a brave little mouse steering the fate of the 1620 voyage, it wasn't aiming for historical accuracy. It was trying to be wholesome, warm, and very, very 1960s. Because back then, if you couldn't solve history with a talking animal and a cheerful musical number, why even bother making a cartoon? But here's the twist. Real rodents were on the Mayflower. And while we don't have detailed logs of how much damage they caused, every source on early modern ships makes one thing clear. Rodents were a constant destructive problem on long voyages. Food loss, rope damage, contamination of barrels, nesting in supplies. So when this cartoon puts a mouse at the center of the story, it's accidentally brushing up against a truth the Pilgrims really faced. And by the time we finish, you may look at your Thanksgiving dinner and maybe even your pantry differently. The cartoon wastes no time giving us its hero, a mouse with morals, courage, and the voice of someone who files taxes early. Your first instinct is something like, okay, adorable. But this is peak 1960s logic. This was an era where animators believed two things. Children needed a moral lesson every 7 minutes, and history was more digestible when delivered by a rodent with impeccable manners. And while no actual mouse donned a cape or gave heartfelt speeches, the Mayflower absolutely had rodents. Not necessarily mice, perhaps rats, perhaps both. Ships of that era almost always did. And unlike the cartoon mouse, whose biggest flaw is being too wholesome, the real ones had a very specific mission: find food anywhere they could. And on ships like the Mayflower, they usually did. To understand why, you have to picture the Mayflower as it truly was. Not the majestic poster. Not the classroom diorama, a dark, cramped cargo ship. Not designed for passengers, not designed for families, definitely not designed for 102 people squeezed into a space barely larger than a modern living room. Imagine the smell of soaked wool that never dries, the sound of coughing echoing in the dark, the sway of the ship, the feeling of being seasick with no escape. Now add rodents to the middle of that misery. To them, the Mayflower was paradise. Food stored in barrels, warm hidden corners, humans too tired or sick to deal with them. They chewed rope, gnawed tools, contaminated food, and did what rodents have always done aboard ships. We don't have exact records of how much they consumed or spoiled. The Pilgrims didn't track losses by mouse appetite, but evidence from similar voyages shows that rodents often cause significant damage to food stores. And even small losses mattered more than we like to think, which is why the cartoon comes surprisingly close to the truth here. We may not know if the rodents destroyed half a ton of food, there's no surviving manifest that lists spoiled weight, but historians agree that food aboard the Mayflower was already limited and not always in good condition. Losing even a modest portion of it could have mattered deeply. Imagine a few sacks torn into, barrels contaminated, grain mixed with droppings, hardtack ruined, not enough to sink the voyage, but enough to tighten the belt on an already hungry community. When you're facing an unknown winter, even moderate spoilage becomes dangerous. So while we can't quantify the exact loss, the principle stands. Rodent damage on ships like the Mayflower created very real hardships. And yes, we'll circle back to that when we reach the first Thanksgiving. Meanwhile, the cartoon shows the crossing as mildly uncomfortable, a windy boat ride with lots of smiling. Very 1960s. Even life and death moments needed to be gentle, family-friendly, and ideally accompanied by a flute solo. Reality? 66 days of cold, sickness, and fear. Food running low, people collapsing, clothing never dry, illness spreading in the dark. A passenger was swept overboard and astonishingly survived. Another died and was buried at sea. And through all this, rodents weren't bothered in the slightest. One could imagine them saying, "Wow, big storm. Anyway, we're going to finish this grain sack." But here's where the cartoon captures something genuinely accurate. The Pilgrims' unity. There probably was not as much spontaneous song as the 1960s would have loved, but there was a fierce sense of community. These were people who had already survived persecution in England, then exile in Holland. They were united before they ever boarded the ship. Before landing, they signed the Mayflower Compact, choosing cooperation over chaos. Not because it sounded poetic, because it was survival, and they would need every ounce of that unity soon. When the first winter hit, it wasn't simply difficult. It was catastrophic. Historical records show that by spring, about half the Pilgrims had died of disease and exposure. Families were broken, children suddenly orphaned, neighbors burying neighbors in frozen ground. While we cannot say rodents caused those losses, every hardship piled onto every other. Limited food, damaged provisions, harsh weather, sickness, exhaustion. Rodent damage wasn't the deciding factor, but it likely added strain to an already desperate fight for survival. This isn't something a 1960s cartoon could or should portray, but the reality was profoundly human and profoundly hard. The special introduces the Wampanoag as kind helpers, but the truth is deeper. The Wampanoag were experienced leaders, farmers, diplomats, and strategists. They already knew Europeans, their ships, and their goods. Massasoit formed an alliance because it made sense, politically, strategically, and for the survival of his people. And Squanto's story, kidnapped, taken to Europe, returned to find his village devastated by disease, is one of the most tragic and extraordinary in early American history. No 1960s cartoon could have captured the full weight of that. But the spirit of cooperation? That part is real. Then the romance subplot appears, suddenly, dramatically, and extremely 1960s. This era had rules. Every family cartoon must include exactly one romance, whether the plot needs it or not. And the soft, glowing haze around animated faces. It looks like someone smeared Vaseline on the lens and whispered, "Make it dreamy." It's adorable. It's hilarious. It's also not how John Alden and Priscilla Mullins actually met, though yes, they did marry after arriving, just not in the middle of a musical number. As for Pilgrim women, the cartoon shows gentle smiles and soft voices. Reality shows iron. Women tended the sick, rationed food, maintained shelters, and held households together when entire families were collapsing. Some outlived husbands lost to the winter and rebuilt their lives from near nothing. Their role wasn't decorative, it was essential. If anyone deserved a musical number, it was them. Spring finally arrived. Crops grew. The alliance with the Wampanoag held. And then we come to the first Thanksgiving. Not the tidy, perfectly arranged feast of the cartoon, but a 3-day outdoor celebration filled with hunting, games, laughter, and relief. Historical accounts show about 90 Wampanoag and 53 surviving Pilgrims participating. It was noisy, chaotic, joyful, a moment of gratitude after profound suffering. Both the real story and the cartoon version capture that spirit, just in very different tones. And finally, we return to the strangest twist of all, even with its musical numbers, pastel romance, and one extraordinarily noble mouse. The Mouse in the Mayflower gets the heart of the story right. Hope, cooperation, gratitude, people helping each other survive. And the mouse? That silly, determined, overly optimistic 1960s mouse might be the most accidentally accurate thing in the whole special. Because real rodents were on ships like the Mayflower, scurrying, nibbling, causing trouble, shaping the journey in small, unseen ways. Not dramatically, not heroically, but truthfully. And somehow, that tiny truth makes the cartoon feel closer to history than anyone expected. So this Thanksgiving, as you sit around your table, eating, laughing, sharing stories, remember, sometimes the littlest things make the biggest difference. And sometimes a silly 1960s cartoon mouse leads you closer to the real story than you'd ever imagine.